South Africa's mining and energy minister has said that the country must manage its energy transition and should not rush to move away from coal-fired power generation. This comes at a time when the coal and gas prices have been surging globally as economies are starting to recover from the coronavirus lockdowns. Coal is a major export for the country, and the transition would have significant impact on the economy. Well, let's talk about some of the expected impact with Matt Kindiger, Associate Practice Lead with Sub-Saharan Africa Frontier View, joining us now from London. Hello, Matt. Good afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for having me on the show today.
Great to have you. So to what extent has the surge in global gas prices influenced the government's reluctance to move away from the coal-fired power generation?
Yeah, so the timing is quite interesting. So I would say it has partly played a role in the government's very clear announcement that it doesn't want to move away from coal-fired power generation. But I would say that the reality is probably a bit more complex. There are a couple of factors at play here behind the government's motivation to stick with coal. One factor is that it has invested quite heavily in new coal-fired power stations over the last decade or so in an attempt to deal with the country's power shortages. So it is extremely reluctant to make significant commitments to reversing its track after making such significant investments into coal. But additionally, the government simply lacks the physical capacity to invest heavily in rapidly changing its energy mix. Although South Africa has massive renewable electricity potential, especially when it comes to wind generation potential and solar power generation potential, the government simply doesn't have the resources to invest in these new technologies. So for the time being, we expect the government to stick more or less with coal over the next couple of years.
And the government wants to increase the role of private sector in power generation. How do we see this going?
Yeah, so South Africa really is in desperate need of reform of the power sector. So the country has been struggling with a lack of power capacity since about 2008. And this is because of a problem with long-term planning when it comes to investment into new power generation capacity. South Africa's electricity industry is dominated by the state-owned utility Eskom, and it has suffered from severe neglect and corruption over the last decade as well. So what the government wants to do is reduce the role of Eskom as a dominant force in the electricity generation sector in South Africa. It plans to do this by offering private sector companies licenses to generate up to 100 megawatts of power. It announced this earlier this year, and it really is seen as a vital step in addressing the country's power sector problems. Although we're unlikely to see an immediate benefit, this is because it will take up to 2 years for new privately run independent power producers to materialize when it comes to being able to generate power on a meaningful scale. So although the private sector is expected to play a bigger role in the generation of power in the coming years, it probably will take a couple of years before we see a benefit.
And which of the industries are most likely to be most affected in the coming years?
Yeah, so certainly the increased role of the private sector in power generation really is a fundamental prerequisite for raising investment, productivity, overall economic growth in the country over the coming years. One of the major reasons why the country has suffered from low economic growth is because of power shortages. So the country's major export-oriented industries, including mining, manufacturing, including the automotive industry, will certainly be the most direct beneficiaries of power sector reform in South Africa. But we could also see smaller and medium-sized enterprises benefit, even those companies that won't be able to invest themselves in independent power production. And this is because if the government decides to allow municipalities to invest in their own independent power production, then we could see mini-grids established in South Africa, which would mean that municipalities could supply power to households and small and medium enterprises. And so this would also be a boost for them over the longer term. But it really does depend on the regulatory approach that the government decides to adopt over the next couple of years.
All right, we'll certainly be following that story to see which regulatory approach they take and the impacts on the economy. Thank you so much, Matt, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.